Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History Summarized Venice on Land by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now we know that OSP loves their Italian city-state history, especially when it comes to Venice, and so this will certainly be a good one. And today we get to talk about Venice on land. Usually when we think about the Venetians, we think about their exploits at sea. Today we'll get the other side of that. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Venice is a state whose entire deal can be explained by one classical element: water. The ancient city is smack in the middle of a lagoon and 75% canals by volume, while its entire existence abroad was similarly aquatic. Venice made its money sailing across the Mediterranean to trade goods, its power lay in an unmatched navy and the best castle moat in the world, and its territory extended along a chain of island outposts from the Adriatic to the Black Sea.
Yeah, we can see that Venice has been very much characterized by its exploits through the Mediterranean. At sea, it was very much an island empire, right? It was known for its seafaring, its trade routes. I mean, this is particularly true when we talk about medieval Venice, or Venice from the Middle Ages, which, when we think about Venice, is often the time period we'll be talking about. I guess we'll see. We'll talk about something different in this video, but I imagine we'll roughly be talking about that same era. And so, yes, as I said in the intro, it's an empire, a city-state, characterized by its exploits at sea. That is what it is best known for. That's how it made its name, and of course, most importantly, made its money. So we'll see if we can get a different side of Venice in this video.
Medieval history of Venice is a game of having as little land as necessary to support an empire made of water. From the city's quasi-mythic founding in the 400s AD through its Byzantine-busting conquest of the Aegean Sea in the 1200s, this was the strat, and Venice played it excellently. But as the centuries rolled on, Venice found the board shifting around them. Expanding trade routes through the Alps meant Central Europe was getting rich enough to actually pay some attention, and by 1349 they'd spun up a state enterprise trading Greek sweet wine for English wool, ferrying that to Flanders to fashion into cloaks, and selling those as far as the Levant.
Yeah, this is true. I mean, when we talk about sort of the high or the late Middle Ages, when we look at these Italian city-states, they, especially in northern Italy, were, some of the richest states in all of Europe, and they'd gained a lot of that wealth from monopolizing Mediterranean trade routes, often grabbing them right from under the Byzantine Empire. But, of course, they took that wealth and they reinvested it into art, architecture, as we know from the Renaissance. They also invested it into other ways of making money, and some of that was invested into industry. Right? So they developed, we're not necessarily talking about more modern industrialization, but they did develop certain industries with which they could trade with other European states in particular. And so they did develop some overland trade routes. They did develop some industry on land, right? Of course, banking was a big thing for some of these Italian states at this time, right? So when we think about them, we do think about particular things: art, architecture, the Renaissance, these Mediterranean trade routes, but these were entire states and some of the richest states of this region of that era. And so they got into a whole bunch of different things, which of course involved them dealing with allies, enemies, trade partners on land as well as on sea.
A nifty circuit. New opportunity was first to catch the Venetian eye, but the real shift in strategy spawned from good old danger. Venice had been cresting the limit of how many people it could house and feed in its little lagoon, but there's no wake-up call quite like getting double besieged. Long tangent short, in 1379 their arch-rival Genoa blockaded Venice by land and sea in hopes of destroying their nemesis forever, and they got unsettlingly close. So having unlocked a thrilling new nightmare to panic about, Venice would not let that happen again, and that required something the sea did not and could not give them. The Republic needed a mainland. Unthinkable, I know, but after running the hell away from Italy 1,000 years prior and staying quite firmly out, this new era demanded new strategies. New markets, more space, more food, and as much buffer between them and their enemies as Venice could possibly claw out. Now, technically, Venice already held the city of Treviso on and off in the 1300s, but that clearly wasn't cutting it, so they needed more.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are obviously some benefits to not having a more classical land empire. When we typically think of empires, we think about the great land empires of history, like the Romans, for example, the Mongols. I mean, there's a bunch of different examples, especially in the pre modern era. And that is how most empires and states of this era worked. Now, Venice typically worked a little differently. We've already talked about how they were so focused on territories across the Mediterranean. In some ways, that made them more flexible, less vulnerable, but as we saw in that conflict with Genoa, at times, especially if the city of Venice was attacked directly, it could also make them somewhat vulnerable. And so now they're trying to protect against that vulnerability by expanding on land, right? Which makes a lot of sense, but of course, you're not going to get the pros without the cons, right? So conquering more territory on land, that's going to bring you some benefits, but there are disadvantages as well.
Thus, the grand reversal of a 1,000-year-long strategy. Back to terraferma they went, and with gusto. This province was known to the Romans as Venetia, and in the Venetian language, which I totally know how to pronounce, Veneto. And here, at long last, they'd claim their namesake region. But then, what even is Venice away from the sea? What does it become when plonked on solid dirt? How does a Venetian cope when bright green fields stretch out forever instead of wine-dark waves? Well, as the next 4 centuries show, they handled it great, and the Republic thrived with a new home on land. So, to see how Venice pulled off their mainland pivot and trace the surprising ways it changed and saved the Republic, twice, let's do some history. Now, Venice liked its conquests like it likes its boats. Fast. That's how they did it in the Aegean after the Fourth Crusade, and that's how they'd play it here. Sweeping across the Po River Valley to the banks of Lake Garda in a year thanks to a skill called exploiting other people's bad luck. See, in the late 1300s, the Scaligeri, lords of Verona, fought neighboring Padova to exhaustion, so Milan swept in to conquer Verona outright in 1388. But here's where it gets exciting for good old Vembus. In 1402, the Duke of Milan suddenly died, leaving the now rudderless city racked by infighting at home and dangerously overextended. Padova swiftly moved to fill the vacuum, so Milan was desperate enough to cut a deal. If Venice rid them of Padova and its meddlesome Carraresi family, they could keep Verona for the trouble, plus nearby Vicenza too. With the border raid as deliciously stealable as they could ever hope for, the Republic had its mission. Get it. Quick as that process was, it was not cheap. The cost of mobilizing an army from all corners of the Republic came out to roughly 10% of the state's annual GDP for every month on campaign. But after the surrender of—
Wow, and of course Venice already has a lot of its money going towards maintaining fleets, both trade fleets mainly, but also for some military purposes, and so, really focusing on land, developing a land army, that's going to take even more money than you're already spending, right? So that's another added expense. However, as we've talked about, Venice is pretty flexible, and so they want to go through with these conquests quickly, which is really the Venetian way. They do not want to get bogged down in some long land war. That's not really how they like to do things.
Verona and Vicenza in 1404.
I mean, they really made their wealth through taking advantage of the, you could say, the downfall of other states and empires. The Eastern Romans, aka the Byzantines, most obviously, right? It's not a causation, but there's correlation between the Byzantine decline and the Venetian rise. Not to say the Venetians played no role in the Byzantine decline. They played a bit of a role, but really, as the Byzantines declined, the Venetians took advantage of that. And so we see here they're taking advantage of their surroundings, right? And if you want to conquer quickly and without getting bogged down, that's what you're going to need to do. You need to be open to opportunities.
Finally, Padova in 1405, Venice had eliminated 2 rivals on its doorstep and gotten nearly everything it wanted out of a mainland state. Alps access, fertile farmlands, urban space, and a giant land buffer on top of their giant moat. Check, 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 and check. A quarter century later, this Stato da Terra had nearly doubled, reaching from Aquileia into Lombardia.
Wow.
Of course, the victory haul of everything they ever wanted and more had a cost greater than mere money, as Venice had sacrificed the luxury of distance and was now firmly committed to playing the game of Italian geopolitics forever.
Yes, right? So I mentioned when you take more land on the mainland, there are advantages, which we've talked about, right? They wanted defense. They didn't want to be so vulnerable to attack on land, but there are going to be some cons, some disadvantages as well. And one of those cons is that instead of you mostly being able to concern yourself with matters across the Mediterranean, and maybe just getting into it with Genoa from time to time. Now you are well and truly enmeshed in the geopolitics of northern Italy. You're involved, and that, can lead you to spend a lot of money on being involved, need to spend a lot of money on maintaining armies, perhaps getting bogged down in long-standing conflicts, right? So it can weigh you down a little bit if
We'll see
you're not careful in particular.
how that unfolds before long, but let's take a look at the cities themselves to see what Venice found in its new domains. Likely the most visible shock was architecture, as Venice had been raised on a strict diet of Eastern Mediterranean aesthetics, whereas the mainland was hard at work developing the Gothic style. Padova had recently finished a masterpiece basilica for their hometown St. Anthony, showing just how much extra height you can get from using pointy arches instead of round ones. As a counterpoint to the Byzantine glitz of St. Mark's Basilica, Padova sported a new and novel style. Meanwhile,
Venice is saying, what the hell's going on? Where did all the round domes go? Now, look, there was a lot of Eastern Roman influence throughout Italy. I mean, depending on when we're talking about, they literally controlled the territory of Italy, but at this point, obviously, the Eastern Roman Empire has been greatly diminished, but even so, a place like Venice, due to that relationship, economic and political, with the Byzantines, and, well, also stealing a bunch of Byzantine art, and just being inspired by their ideas and their architecture. When you see Venice, you see some deeply Eastern Roman influences on their art and architecture. And like I said, that was true elsewhere, but definitely more in Venice than other places. And so you do see the development of different styles of architecture in some of these new territories Venice was conquering.
Verona's old Scaligere lords had whipped up a gorgeous set of tombs in the city, taking the ornamentation of Gothic as far as their chisels would carry them. All these influences found their way back to Venice, inspiring taller spaces and bold new decorations in the fusion of Byzantine, Islamic, and mainland European styles that we call Venetian Gothic.
Ooh, interesting. And I will say, this time period is when we get the real development of that Gothic style, and a lot of these massive cathedrals are built. Well, some of these massive cathedrals are built. The thing is, a lot of the Gothic architecture we see today was actually done a few hundred years later, often in the 1800s, and so it's almost like Gothic revivalist architecture, right? It was inspired by this initial wave of Gothic architecture, right? And unless you know that, I find people get pretty mixed up to think, oh yeah, this is all Gothic architecture. And it is, but some of it is the, original Gothic architecture. And then a lot of the Gothic architecture we see today is really more inspired by that initial wave, which had happened more in this time period we're looking at here.
Inventive as it was, this felt right at home in the lagoon since it was totally allergic to moderation, going all in on lavish details. The citizens of Verona would have been impressed to see their city's tombs as the soft influence for the processional entryway to the Doge's palace, as well as the far more direct model for the crockets atop St. Mark's Basilica. Scarcely 50 years after the mainland pivot, and the heart of Venice was reflecting this new world. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the mainland is also the reason Venice got the Renaissance, as they entered the Italian art world right when artists were breaking out of the medieval mold to play with composition, color, space, perspective, and posing. Right at the start of the 1300s in Padova, the artist Giotto took an early step towards Renaissance naturalism with the Scrovegni Chapel, painting familiar Bible scenes in fully realized environments, striving for dynamism and emotion in his characters. Clearly, Venice was a fan, as they imported mainland artists to fresco up the Doge's palace after 1400. Fast forward to the 1500s, and the Venetian Renaissance bore the masterpieces of Titian, Tintoretto, and countless other brilliant painters. That same century, the third jolt to the Venetian aesthetic also sprung from the mainland, as
And I will say, you might be thinking, was Venice really so much more influenced by the Eastern Mediterranean than by the mainland before this? I mean, they're literally right next to these more mainland Italian states. How could they be more influenced by, say, the Byzantines, who were so far away? And the answer is, look, of course they were drawing influence from the mainland even before this, but you gotta remember that mainland travel is so much slower than travel by sea in this period, right? Travel by sea is so much faster, and Venice really was an empire of the sea, of the Mediterranean. And so, yes, it is true that, even though there's a bit of a distance between Venice and Constantinople, they really were drawing a lot of their influence from Constantinople, from the Byzantines. As we saw on the map, Venice had a bunch of land, or sort of, you could say, colonies set up along these islands in the eastern Mediterranean. There were a lot of Venetians settled in along these island chains in modern-day Greece, in Constantinople, and so yes, they were really drawing so much more influence from the eastern Mediterranean, from the Byzantines, than they perhaps were from a lot of their, closer states. But as we see here, as they pivot towards the land, that starts to change.
That same century, the third jolt to the Venetian aesthetic also sprung from the mainland, as Vicenza's Andrea Palladio looked to classical models when designing villas, civic buildings, and church facades. Before long, the lagoon was sporting Palladian visions as the design language for new churches and a really elegant way to handle running facades like the ones on St. Mark's Square. But one angle on Palladio that's easy to skip over, don't look at me like that, is his focus on villas, because it represents the arrival of the Republic's aristocracy in a completely new context. No longer a state entirely of seafaring merchants, but increasingly one of landowners who wanted to retain a Venetian elegance away from the comfy canals of home. This new lifestyle was hardly as exciting as setting sail for distant shores, but far more consistent against a rapidly changing economy.
Yeah, more consistent, and, funnily enough, and I guess this isn't really contradictory, but in many ways, this is drawing back to older Italian or even Roman tradition. I mean, when we think back to the Italy of the old Roman Empire or the Roman Republic, and we think about, say, the senators, the patricians of that state, it was a class of wealthy Italian landowners, right? And so that's what it was back then, and some of these other Italian states maintained that, though, of course, following the collapse of Western Rome, Italy did lose a fair amount of its wealth for a long time, and now Venice is sort of returning to that older tradition, a little less focused on seafaring and more focused on having your countryside estate, right? Like a lot of these old Romans of the classical era.
Ottoman and Spain-shaped reasons we'll see in a minute. Palladio's architecture remade the face of Vicenza and inspired the rest of the Republic, but it's also emblematic of how the Republic in turn transformed its mainland cities. At first, this was quick and efficient. Venice takes a city, throws in a winged lion on a big column, bingo, Vembus in charge. But as the centuries went on, the mainland cities built public and civic works in the image of and in service of the Republic. In the 14 and 1500s, Padova got a new clock tower, which inspired the iconic clock tower in St. Mark's Square, as well as a new home base for the long-standing University of Padova in the gorgeous double-colonnaded Palazzo Bo. First founded in 1222 as an offshoot of the University of Bologna, Padova's university was the second oldest in Italy, and during the Venetian era, it was the only place where the Republic's nobility could study, lest they be corrupted from learning in icky foreign lands and come back home thinking monarchy is cool. Gross. In return, Venice granted the university immense academic freedom, so they gladly welcomed foreigners, and once the distinction became relevant, even Protestants. That permissive attitude extended into the studies themselves, as famed scientists Galileo and Copernicus both spent time at the University of Padova, with Galileo describing his time teaching there as the best 18 years of my life.
Wow. You can see that they're really bringing in a lot of free thinkers in an era when there were an increasing number of free thinkers, but there were not a lot of places that those free thinkers were welcomed. I'll put it that way.
Sure it is.
If you were sort of separating yourself from religious orthodoxy, you'd want to be careful where you went.
Galileo describing his time teaching there as the best 18 years of my life. I'm sure it at least beat house arrest.
Yeah.
So, with the arrival of the Republic on terraferma, Venice became more like the mainland, and the cities of the Veneto became more like the lagoon. After a millennium spent looking firmly east and doing its best to ignore the giant peninsula directly behind it, Venice was finally becoming Italian. But for all the benefits to grand strategy and pretty culture, being an Italian state meant all of your neighbors constantly wish you dead.
Yes. It's interesting. Becoming a little more Italian means that, on the downside, you're going to have constant violent rivalry with the other Italian states in the area, but it does mean as we move forward into the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, I know that's a long period of time, but over the next few hundred years, there does develop a more general sense of Italian identity. Now, that has a lot more to do with the advent of nationalism in the late 17 into the 1800s. There's a lot more there, but it does help that Venice, for example, is now a little more integrated into mainland Italy and is a little more separated from many of their land holdings further to the east. And of course, they're going to lose those land holdings as the years continue, if we want to talk about the Ottomans, for example, but I think we'll get to that.
Unfortunately for La Serenissima, Milan finally got its act together, and Venice began the long slog of playing defense. By 1426, Venice had pushed past Lake Garda to take the city of Brescia, but in 1438, Milan swept east to recapture as far as Verona. Venice might have been new at this, but they weren't about to give up that easily, so the Republic hatched a plan to sail a small fleet up the Adige River, then beach the ships and drag them through the mountains to plonk them in the north of the lake and sail down to surprise Milan's fleet.
Wow. I love that. They said, oh, we've got a land invasion. We're dealing with warfare on land. Everyone, get the boats. We're gonna do what we do best.
That's insane. Venice pulled Hannibal strats with boats.
Wow.
But even worse, it worked. Venice beat Milan, retook Brescia and Verona in 1440, and proved that the Republic, which bested the Byzantines, wasn't afraid of their land-loving neighbors. God, they're so fucking cool. Tranquillo, Blue, tranquillo. This period of relative peace lasted until 1508, when a Genoa-born pope chose violence, inviting Germany and France into an alliance of...
A Genoa-born pope! That's bad news for the Venetians. And look, we think of the Venetians, or Venice, as a, trading empire of the Mediterranean, and that's true, but becoming that trading empire took a lot of warfare and violence, right? So they were pretty used to this type of thing, and a lot of that warfare would have been at sea, but not exclusively. They had done their share of fighting on land as well. So they were not entirely unprepared for what's happening here, though it's a bit of a different scene than they had been involved in.
1508, when a Genoa-born pope chose violence, inviting Germany and France into an alliance of friendship, fun, and murdering Venice. It didn't work as planned, partly because that pope was an idiot who panicked when the foreign armies he invited showed up to his peninsula and looked a lot scarier in person, so he swiftly allied with Venice to repel the invaders. Then Venice completed the circuit by allying with France against the pope to claw back its original borders.
Wow.
To make a long pope fight short, Venice kept its beloved terraferma, this time for good, but its cities and countryside suffered mightily in the shuffle. Now, agonizing as that war had been, the following century would prove much more perilous, as the very foundation of its power was threatened from the east and the far, far west. First was the Ottoman menace, who, having toppled the Byzantines on land, now resolved to kick Venice out of their pond.
Yeah, that's the thing. We've been talking about Venice expanding onto land in northern Italy, but that didn't change the fact that they still had the core of their empire scattered throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and that's where they were making a lot of their money. Now, we saw that, they developed a more stable economy on land. They had refocused a little bit, but it was still important to them to keep all of this territory. And now we've seen a new player enter the scene, the Ottomans, and as they usurped the very weak Byzantines, very weak at this point, the Ottomans are saying, we are the new, king in town, essentially. We are going to rule this land. We do not want Venetians scattered around the edges of our empire causing trouble.
End of the century, Venice lost Cyprus and nearly all their Aegean holdings, and the 1600s saw the extra painful fall of Crete. Rough, but survivable, as Venice was a trade powerhouse before it held those islands, and it could remain one after.
Yeah.
Except for a very big...
And before we get to that, I will say, in the first place, I know it sounds a little strange to say because we've been talking about Venice on land, and even before that, how they controlled these territories to the east. But really, Venice taking some of these islands in the Mediterranean in the first place was sort of a change of pace, right? They had been this trading state that was focused on monopolizing trade routes rather than territory, and then when they even started taking territory, it was a bit of a shift, right? So like they say, Venice had been this trading empire even before that, but, as we're about to get to, the Ottomans were not the only threat to Venetian dominance.
rock on the opposite side of the Atlantic Ocean, as Spain began colonizing the New World while Portugal sailed underneath Africa to reach Asia, opening two massive new markets to the world and leaving the Republic's old trade routes too expensive and too dangerous to bother with. Naval power? Poof. Trade monopoly? Also poof. Uh-oh, Vembis. Not looking good. Europe's pivot to the Atlantic while the Ottomans munched on the Med is the kind of 1-2 punch that would have sunk medieval Venice during its aqua-only heyday.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Ottomans, while not completely cutting off Venice, greatly reduced Venice's access to the eastern Mediterranean and the lands beyond. They already had challenged their trade monopoly. And then you've got the Portuguese, who are finding new ways to access goods from the Far East. And you've got Spain, who is now bringing in a whole bunch of new goods and, importantly, gold and silver from the Americas. All of those things are an incredible threat to the economy and the standing of Venice, but this whole video has been about how they had sort of moved in a different direction, so, let's see how they deal with this. As they were just saying, the Venice of old perhaps would have collapsed entirely under these pressures.
But the Republic of the Renaissance era was on much different footing, no longer the lone master of the seas nor fabulously rich, but in command of a stable terra firma. So as Venice shifted focus to things it could make in-house, luxury goods like glass and lace, plus becoming the dominant player in Europe's burgeoning bookmaking industry.
Yep, and this, by the way, I talked about the development of those industries earlier. This is that coming to fruition, right? Thankfully for Venice, like I said, they had reinvested a lot of that trade money they had coming in, and they reinvested it in a lot of things, but one of those things was local industry. And now that investment is paying dividends, right? They still have an economy, even after their dominance over these trade routes has been taken.
The Veneto provided steady income, consistent food, plenty of space, and a vital buffer for the lagoon, more valuable here in the latter centuries than Venice could have ever imagined back in 1400. Without the myriad benefits of the mainland, Venice could have easily hit game over centuries ahead of schedule. Having a mainland is objectively the most normal thing Venice ever did, but the way they handled it and the effect it had on their culture is so darn weird it could only be Venice.
It's interesting because like they said, this is pretty normal. We're talking about developing a land empire, which is what the vast majority of empires do. This is nothing different than most states. But for Venice, it's a little different. This is a change of pace for them. And so they do it a bit differently than everybody else.
Each city in the Stato da Terra built upon the Venetian identity, in Gothic and neoclassical architecture, in educating the citizens, in producing luxury goods like silk, books, and violins, and in building the Renaissance itself. All icons of Venice owing massively to the mainland. And despite all this being on solid grounds, the way they got and kept it is classic them, winning territory through crafty diplomacy and keeping it through the most bonkers strategies imaginable. What sane state would lose a major city for the first time and immediately think, I've got an idea, let's wheel a fleet of ships through the mountains to drop them in a lake? So, what have we learned? You can take Venetians off the boats, but you can't take the boats out of Venice. Because, they're 100 miles inland in the lake. Thank you for watching.
Alrighty, I certainly enjoyed that one. As we know, Blue from OSP, he loves his Italian history, really all of it, Venice in particular. We've seen a bunch of their videos, well, on a lot of things at this point, but particularly on classical history, on medieval Italian history. They always do a great job. I always enjoy the history videos they put together. This one's no different. Another interesting video on Venice itself, getting a bit of a different look at Venice from how we typically think about it, but also really showing us how Venice was able to survive from the Middle Ages into the early modern era, right? They survived their monopoly, right? Their monopoly on these eastern trade routes. I mean, okay, they never truly had a monopoly, but they had dominance, right? They had dominance of a lot of these eastern Mediterranean trade routes. Once those disappeared, once they lost a lot of their territory, their island territory in the eastern Mediterranean, we saw how they managed to survive that into a new era of history, right? When the Ottomans and the Spanish and the Portuguese became dominant, Venice it was no longer as dominant as it used to be, but it survived as a relatively stable state with an active economy, unable to protect itself at least as well as everybody else. So, yeah, some really fascinating stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that, hope everybody's having a great day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.